So, I'll be giving this in English just because I can, and that's my normal tongue. I switched it. I hope it's okay. I learned a bit of English in school. Thank you for traveling with the Deutsche Bahn. Anyway, the main thing is people think like, oh, isn't Bagel boring? No, I bought this book. Then I was interested in Jewish history. I bought this book. Then I liked bread. I bought this book. Then I thought it would be cool to learn something about Arabic cooking because it's also related. And then, of course, most of the book is based on the Bagel, A Complete History. So, yeah, if you're interested in Jewish cooking, that's really good, but it's not that many pages on bagels. Anyway, if you wonder what the recipes are that we cooked today, I hope you liked it. Well, anyway, that's just for the start, because if you probably saw me this, but what I'm really underneath is this. Aha. Well, anyway, and if you wonder what this is, you'll be wise at the end of my talk. If I look sometimes on the screen, it's just because I finished the talk a couple of years ago, and it had something to do with bagels here, so I couldn't prepare. Yes, because then I need to come here from Bulgaria, from conference, and bake some bagels. Anyway, let's see. So, a question here for the round. Who of you thinks that a 1900 century, like a bagel, like a New Yorker from 1900 would know what a bagel is? Because I think bagel we all associated with New York. Who would think this? Please, hands up. Oh, it's a trick question. Cool. Nobody. They would probably not know what a bagel is. Probably the few Jewish folks there, but not that many. To quote New York Times in the 1950s, a bagel is a donut with rigor mortis. For the Germans here, rigor mortis is the thing that they're like, when you die. The bagel is incapable of taking itself so seriously, so I don't do it either in this talk. Because the problem in the 1950s were the New Yorkers didn't know what a bagel was, but it was cropping up all over the town. They were like, what's this weird thing there? So they thought it was a donut, but no, it's not a donut. It's a completely different dough. Please don't use donut dough and boil them in water. I think it's called Grießknödel in Germany, but anyway. So where does the word come from? That's one of the ideas here, of course, taking from a Yiddish book, but you probably know the word Biegen in German. That became Beigen, that's Bagel, and that's then a bagel because a bagel is round. And no, there's no bagel from today. These are sesame seeds. I baked them a week ago to test it. Yeah, I need to prepare the talk. I probably prepared more the bagel stand than the talk. Anyway, so sometimes you see that Beigen also means like bracelet, which kind of comes handy when you have it on a string on your neck. It originated the word in kind of the Eastern Europe. And the fun thing is that there are two different pronunciations. So there's either the Bagel or the Beagle pronunciation, depending on whether you're in Galicia or Lithuania. Not that you need to know this. Anyway, you might be interested how to do this. You could have done a bagel shift, but you didn't. That's a picture from last year because I was too busy baking than to take photos. Yeah, essentially you bake them. If you want to know how it works, essentially you just take a piece of dough, you roll it, and then you have a rope and roll it together, and then you boil it for like half a minute in water with honey, or here it's with malt. And essentially the main idea is that you then gelatinize the outside so that it boils nice and has like a outside that's like firm and then inside that's soft, so that it's like rigor mortis, like a donut with rigor mortis. The debate whether there's egg or not in this is a long one. I'm not going into this now. Anyway, now to the origins. The family tree is quite big because, like, why not? That's something that you might not know, but it's a tarallo. It's from Puglia in Italia, and it's essentially made like a bagel. It's just tiny. And there is some idea that maybe this and another Italian bread then came together with a queen of Poland that was Italian from the Medici or something, I think it was Medici, and came to Poland. She brought it with it. The only problem is she came later after the word bagel was first noted in Yiddish in a rule book. So that's a dead end, but it's a nice story. Anyway, if you draw the long run, as my herald here, thanks Sarah, already told you, it might be coming from the bucellatum, which is a Roman flatbread round that came to the Arabs, and then it became something. It might become then the tarallo in Italy. Then it kind of moved over Germany to be an upward again in a bagel. But there's so many different ideas of how the bagel became. But I'll start it here. One of the Navarczyk is like a sibling of bagel, as we see in a bit. It's essentially the same, but just twisted. Oops. That's why I brought pretzels. That's the original bagel. That's one of the pictures. I have different pictures here. So if these are vegan pretzels, if you want pretzels, just maybe take also parts of them, just pass them through. Freshly baked vegan with the same dough as the bagels today. It's a similar dough, just made a different batch because it's obviously not a bagel. And if you look at it and taste of it, it's essentially like a bagel. There's debates how lye came into the game. I think before the people also boiled and steamed the pretzels. But this is the precursor of the pretzel, of the bagel. Juchei. So Germans did it again. Interesting. That's not an oven timer that I'm used to. Anyway, our whole story's... Okay. The whole story starts in Germany, but really came into fruition into Poland. What we call Poland here is kind of interesting. We aren't calling about the current Poland, we're calling about the big duchy of Poland, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I've been to Lithuania, they really like the Commonwealth because they are like, we were big. But anyway, so we're talking about this whole area. When I mention Poland, think of this. So think of Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltics, and some part of Russia. So essentially the idea was that, we have to talk about what I also wrote in the content warning. Of course, Jews didn't have the easiest time, to say it kindly. But what in Poland was that the Polish kings were like, we are agrarian, we need people to kickstart our economy. So what do? You just take people that are prosecuted elsewhere, tell them, here you have religious freedom, you can do whatever you want, but please, 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 bring money and your knowledge. That's how it happened. This is why a lot of German, that's the story, brought the pretzels and something similar with them. And essentially the idea is that the pretzel originated in the monasteries, so that's why it's like the folded arms. And one can trace it back to the early Christians. I'm not doing this. It was far too deep in this book. I don't bother you with this. But essentially also that means one of the cousins is probably the Simmet. And there's another story related to the kings defeating the Ottomans. But anyway, the main idea is that bagel is a really big part of Jewish food in Eastern Europe. And this is the Navarczyk, but essentially the idea was bagel became big and bigger, and that's what we're talking here about. The only problem with this is actually from Krakow, for whatever reason 3 weeks ago I was there, not only to eat a sibling of a bagel, but the idea was that in 1494 there was a problem with there was a fire in Krakow, and the people thought it was the Jews. Yes. And they kicked them out, and then they started to settle outside, and they grew like their own community and were like separate, but that meant they conclude their own customs. Here it is, Krakow is predicted in the Nuremberg Chronicles, published in around the same time. And the Jews were kicked out, but the cool thing was that they settled in a Städtel, which is kind of like the German Stadt, but they settled outside. They were not allowed to bring the bagels into the city, but they were allowed to bake them, and essentially the bagels, Oh yeah, that's why I'm outside of the kitchen. Yeah. Anyway, that's a dark one. Yeah, the first mention of the word bagel was in 1610. Funnily enough, funnily enough, in regulations from the Jewish Council, because they said, okay, we have regulations around bagel because bagels at the time were made of wheat. That's quite expensive, and they want to keep it a luxury good. Because, yeah, the rich Jewish people didn't like the poor Jewish people. Welcome, capitalism. Bagels themselves symbolize the eternal cycle of life. So they were essentially eaten at funerals, they were eaten at circumcisions. That was quite a common food there. And they were told to prevent the evil from coming in. Yeah, we're talking religious here. The fun thing is then that like they were kicked out and everything was a bit bleaker, but then there was Jan Sobieski. He was a Polish king, and he depended a lot on Jews to like work on, to administrate his farms and also to give him money to fight his wars. And he defeated the Turks in Vienna, which is quite cool for like our... no, anyway. But the cool thing is he needed the Jews. He needed also more people to come in to rebuild his country, because before there were some tumults. And he gave them freedom. He even like supported them against superstition. And yeah, in Eastern Europe, then many of the Jews became rich, but of course many of them also stayed poor. Capitalism, yay. The only problem is, yeah, and then after, yeah, and as I said, it developed in the shtetl. This is an old picture from like a shtetl scene, but they were essentially like smaller to medium-sized cities outside of bigger cities, where they could still trade with the main city, but where they were living mostly under each other and were pretty safe from persecution, and that was pretty cool. And there's also where all the culture like blossomed. And the cool thing is, bagels themselves are really cool for Sabbath, because you prepare the bagel, you do everything, you let them cool, and then you bake them afterwards because you've done all the work. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. And to quote the Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Rutten, the food was the link between the holy and the profane, so it was quite important for them there. To quote another thing, a Yiddish song from the late 19th century, for a tailor to work the entire week was his goal, yet he earned only a bagel with a hole. The fun thing is, when you look at the poetry, that from the beginning, the focus was mostly on the dough, and then poetry switched to the hole. Yes, now you know this, sorry. The problem with Poland was, you probably all know, they were split up a couple of times. Also, they were split up in 1795. The economy suffered, Poland was poor. But the thing is, the Jewish community was really instrumental because they stayed. They also helped when it got better to rebuild the whole economy, and because they didn't have any choice, they couldn't go elsewhere. So they were the reasons why the cities there still exist. Why we probably have the big cities there like Krakow, because they were there supporting. And the cool thing is, I asked the people afterwards that they have 10 minutes more.
We have no talk after you.
Yes, haha. Because yes. Still, then I can talk slower. Nice. Anyway, I have a video in that we can play afterwards. Yeah, so a fun thing is also when you want to cruise on someone, you can also say, go and bake bagels. Because the problem was bakers were like at this event, you love it and hate. Sometimes they produce burnt bagels. And sometimes, especially in times of hardship, they mix other things in. And the problem was also bagel baking was quite hard. The dough for bagels, if you don't have like a food processor, which they didn't have at the time, you had to knead by foot. And so it was quite moist. It was hard labor. But the cool thing is, it was also used for emancipation. So selling bagels was one of the accepted trades at the time in Poland that women could do. Like where they could earn money, were also especially people were, kids were the dad's side, they went out of the street and were like, "Wanna have a bagel? Wanna have a bagel?" And this was accepted. It was kind of illegal, but nobody cared, and that was an interesting time. And the fun thing here is in Poland. I told you that in Krakow there was also the other version of the bagel, like a sibling, and this was baked by non-Jewish. The only problem was that later, like in the next few centuries, it was the case that ever more bakers were speaking Yiddish and were Jewish. So at the end of the 19th century, like half the bakers were just Jews. So the thing that you were called Obnerweizig was probably a bagel there, which is kind of fun. For comparison, end of 1918, Jews in Poland were quite big. 10% of the country was Yiddish speaking, so like culturally Jewish. And the fun thing also, Yiddish became more and more important in the 19th century. Like other countries, like in Germany, we had our national movements, and there you had also the movement to like have their own identity. So that's why Yiddish is so important, because many of the people came from Germany. Yiddish sounds a bit like German, which is kind of cool, because I was in Canada for the first time, and some New Yorkers told me when we were eating bagels, like, "Oh, and then we put on smear," and wanted to explain to me what the smear was, and I'm like, "I'm German, I know what a smear is, because it's Schmiere, like the spread that you put on top." So that's pretty cool. They didn't know it because they thought like Yiddish was something special. No, it's just essentially kind of German, and that moved further away. Then we're coming to the infamous part that we all like here, sadly. Yes?
You might want to think about what you just said.
What?
That Yiddish is not special, it's just some kind
Sorry, yes, I'm
still
it's special.
language.
Yes.
Every language is special.
Yes.
And it has connections to German, especially
Yeah.
the dialect. Like I'm from Berlin, I understand probably a bit more than people from America, but usually English.
Yes, thank you.
I think it was just
Yes, thank you. That was a bit short, but the comment was from the audience. Thank you. Was that of course it's its own language. What I want to say with the previous words was of course that is a proper language, but it is probably like you have Latin that evolved into Italian, which you could say Italian is just a Latin dialect that they spoke somewhere into the boroughs. I think it's similar, because someone who speaks Italian can probably understand a lot of Italian, but the same as other way around is probably also kind of true. So yes, it's kind of a dialect. But I also want to say it's a Germanic dialect. It's like probably it has some basis on it, but of course, like it's a language that had like 500, 600 years to evolve, and yeah, when you look at, for example, U.S. English and British English, that only had like 100 years to evolve. Gosh, don't talk to a Midwesterner with your British that you learn at school. They don't understand you. But anyway, thank you. Yeah, Yiddish is of course a cool language. I sadly don't speak it, but I like the klezmer music. Sadly, the DJs didn't have any at the VOC 10, so yeah, that's why you didn't have Yiddish. Anyway, now to the interesting part of this topic. Yes, we have to talk about it, sorry. We have to talk about programs. Essentially, the Jewish history is, of course, has sadly a lot of maltreatment. And that's also why many Jews then moved to the US just to look for a better life. Because yes, it was quite nice for them in Poland, especially with Jan Zubelski, who gave them a lot of freedom. But the problem was that times changed, and there were programs, especially at the end of the 18th, at the end of the 19th century, especially in the part that was controlled by Russia, that moved over. A fun part is that moved over, and that was, in this sense, not great, but it meant that like between 1982 and then 1920, around 60,000 Jews came to America every year, which is quite tremendous. So by the 1920s, more than 2 2.3 million have arrived in the US, and many stayed, of course, in New York. That's the only problem was the living conditions weren't that good. They weren't like fleeing from a totally poor situation into the US, and they were like blossoming, but they lived in I think it was the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where the conditions were cramped. They were used as cheap labor. Of course, there was also anti-Semitism there from the other people, but essentially, they got out, and yeah. The thing is related to the bagel. The other things that came afterwards, they aren't relevant to the bagel, sadly. So that's the main reason here. Of course, in the 80s, you had in the between years, like between 1920 and then 1938 or something, also relate to the Great Depression. Many Jews moved to the US to find a better fortune, and then essentially after the Second World War, they mixed up together, and it became like a proper melting pot there, also for Jewish identity that in the end finally came back to Europe then, and also Israel. Now we're focusing on New York bagels because they're great. A fun thing that I didn't say before, but why bagels also became ubiquitous was because Ukraine had such fertile soil. The Russians began growing a lot of wheat, so it was quite cheap to get wheat at the end of the 19th century, or like middle of the 19th century. So people started eating more and more bagel. There's one history that says, one statistic that says that people like at the mid-19th century were eating 50 kilos of wheat a year and 200 kilos of potatoes. I hope that's per person or not per family. I haven't checked. But that means that while wheat was still something that was special, it wasn't something that was like not every day. So many people could just buy them and it was cheap. Now, of course, they moved over to New York. Of course, they moved also elsewhere, but one of the melting pots is New York, and I think there were some stats that New York is one of the biggest Jewish city in the world. Some nodding here, cool. Also, the other city that's important is Montreal. Ooh, guess what we're talking more about. The thing was, because bagel, as I said before, was a really crucial part of the identity. There were lots of movies, there were lots of songs, lots of stories, lots of poems about them. It meant that everywhere Jewish people went, they of course took their bagel. They of course took their yalla, their like yeasted bread. They took a lot of things, and they took it to New York. And that's how it might look like in the typical scene. That's from 1938, where you see people saying all kinds of words from the sound lines, and there were also almost certainly people selling bagels there. And the Lower East Side, as I said, was the heart of the Jewish immigrant New York. The only problem was they were also baked in this area. And you see these underground parts. The bagels were baked there. The rooms were 2 meters high, so I could stand in them, but some of you might not. They were cramped, they were hot, there were cockroaches, rats, and mice in them. And that's where they baked the bagels, and they didn't get paid a lot of money, and that was a problem for them. They could work there, that was good. Like they could also earn some money. It wasn't a really good place. Yeah, and it was pretty cramped down there. I think you wouldn't like to live there, but it was starting to change. So to quote what the New York bagel is, as a quote from a book, the purest New York bagel is made by throwing rings of risen dough into violently boiling water for a few seconds, then draining, cooling, and baking them quickly till golden, shiny, and crisp. They are wonderful when very, very fresh and still spongy inside. Isn't this like food porn? There's sadly no bagels tomorrow, so haha. But I hope the pretzels were at least good stuff. This is a bagel that I ate in New York when I was there. Of course, I went to 8 bagel bakeries in 7 days. You would do the same. The fun thing, as I said, bagels weren't that popular they were like till the 1950s, 60s, they were largely unknown. Of course, they were important for their community there, and because more and more Jews were coming, this community also grew. They got richer, they earned more. They ate a lot of bagel. Yeah, the only problem was, and I hope that's also coming in the slides. No, I'm just telling you anyway. The only problem is, guess what? Cream cheese wasn't that great for. Cream cheese wasn't an invention that was in the original bagels, because many of the Jews were lactose intolerant. This doesn't match with cream cheese, like 75% according to a Harvard's 2015 study. But anyway, they would much more prefer their bagels with chicken fat and goose fat. The only problem is the organizers, I couldn't find any chicken fat here, so you had to take care of salmon. Salmon they also didn't properly have, but salmon was pretty cheap there. Some of you might have tried the raisin and cinnamon bagel yesterday. This is literally because they were like, could we make it more appealing to the Gentiles or the non-Jews? They were like looking at what Germans were doing with the yeast dough, and we're saying, they're putting raisins and cinnamon in for Christmas. Let's just do this. The fun thing with Blueberry Day was today, that's apparently mostly popular in South Korea. That has nothing to do with Jewish culture. It's just because they found out South Koreans like it. It was like a hit in Asian markets, and so it came back. Bagel history is just a multicultural melting pot, and that's really great because it shows people coming together and having fun with food. Essentially, also they put on some sausage on there, but that was totally not kosher in more senses than one. Anyway, let's go further. A fun thing there was that there was also a local bakers union. And just to give you some stats, if you want to be, and it was till the 1950s, end of 1950s, it was dissolved, but they had only 300 members, meetings in Yiddish only, of course, and apprenticeship to get in, you had to roll 832 bagels an hour. To compare this with what we achieved, I said yesterday to roll some New York bagels. We said for 2 hours, we got 200 bagels. I think they're slightly faster and might have laughed at me. A proper bagel baker, he would have done this in like 15 minutes and was like, and now what? He could have enjoyed the event here and didn't spend his whole evening there. Anyway, become a bagel baker. No, it's not. But the cool thing is, I'm not covering this here, but it's a whole other topic because the baker unions were pretty strong. They caused bagel famines because they just said, we want better pay. We don't work. You don't have bread. Nice. And they were starting to be one of the unions. One of the important unions. Anyway, that's a bagel in here. Now I'm coming to mostly the end. But anyway, that's a bagel here that comes from a factory line because the Canadian inventor Dan Thompson created the first viable automated bagel machine, and then the people striked. Why have this? Just shortly, because that's a bagelette. Someone apparently had this for 30 years. That was marketing stunt in a kid show from Rama. Nice.
Is this a bagel ad?
It's not a bagel ad. Try again. Cool. Now shortly.
Silvery wedding gown with a white bodice.
So they've popularized Philadelphia. And
Really chose a fiance with good taste. All who know them agree that Len and Phil are the perfect partners.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here
anyway,
bagel with cream cheese.
Anyway, so that's how they went national. They started producing them en masse, and it was fine. And then it was just growing. They were freezing them and for shipping them. There wasn't any good bagels outside of New York, but then, of course, there was another recession. Yay! The 2008 one. People got away from New York and shared their bagels with them. Now, shortly to the most important bagels, Montreal bagels. There's either Fairmont bagels, learn more about the Monday approach. Essentially, someone came, also Jew came in, got together with some other folks, founded Fairmont Bagels, then he got further, founded Saint Viateur Bagels. That's how it goes. And I'm a Saint Viateur fanboy. I bought this T-shirt in Montreal. Anyway, but it's like poutine. It's really important there. That's a picture that I took. That's how they roll the bagels by hand in a cafe all day. That's pretty awesome. And that's the difference. Like it's just slightly more like the German pretzel here. Yeah, and then the bagels also went to space. Of course, it was Fairmont that went to space. I like the other picture more. That was a Fairmont bagel in there. They're pretty good. Bagels now are a 6 billion market, so start making your bagels. And to close it, it is through its reflection in American eyes that the Jewish food of Eastern Europe has become fashionable in Israel. Anyway, this closes the circle. If you want to learn much more, I give you 2 recipes. Here's the collection of all the things that I wrote from the box, so it's just a raw pad. Thanks for coming here. And if you want to learn more about bagels or just talk about some weird bread stuff or Arabic food, just come afterwards to me and have a nice day. Thank you.